The sun hung high, slicing clean lines of light across the Fort Bragg rifle range. It was the kind of light that offered no kindness, just exposure. There was no hiding on that field. Only the sharp reality of who belonged and who didn't. I didn't. The earth beneath my boots was red clay, fine as dust, and it clung to the hem of my khakis. My gray t-shirt was already stained at the shoulder, but I stood straight. No rifle slung over my back, no insignia on my chest. Just a small canvas bag slumped by my feet, stitched with a mark only one or two here might recognize, and only if they remembered ghosts. The others didn't see a ghost. They saw a disruption. Colonel Davis watched from behind the line, his shadow short and tight beneath him, his arms folded with a tired sneer. He turned his head just enough to let his voice carry. "Get the tourist off my line before she shoots herself." Laughter followed, unrestrained, easy. A chorus of camouflage and arrogance. Some raised their phones, their lenses catching the image of the lone woman among trained men, the civilians surrounded. I didn't move. I kept my eyes forward, steady on the lane before me. I felt their noise pass over me like wind. I was used to noise. "When my mother was dying in the hospital," I said, my voice even and firm, "she didn't ask me to be strong." That stilled them for a second. Not enough to quiet them, but enough to fracture the rhythm of their laughter. She said, "Never let them say you're weaker than me." I turned my head slightly, just enough for my voice to reach them all. Today, I came to fulfill her last command. The laughter died for good after that. Phones lowered, soldiers exchanged looks like something had tilted in the air. Unspoken but heavy. Davis shifted his weight, his mouth a grim line. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The weight of my words wasn't for him. It was for me. I stood still, the sun hard against my back, the earth warm beneath my feet. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I stood still and rooted, but my mind slid back, the way it always did when I was watched like this. The way it had since I was 14, since the bunker. It was cold in that place. Cold in a way that got into your bones and didn't leave. I remember curling into a ball near the wall, beside rusting equipment. Pressed so close I thought I might vanish into the concrete. But the cold wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the silence between the radio bursts. The static. The sudden nothing. The waiting. Above me, through the narrow hatch and the clumsy metal of the periscope, I saw shadows stretch long and lean across the Afghan sand. The men and women in my mother's unit moved like smoke, precise, lean, and focused. Even then I understood their elegance, their fluidity. I didn't have a word for it, but I knew. They were dangerous and beautiful all at once. At their center was my mother, Major Abigail Carter. She didn't lead with bravado. She didn't have to. Her command was quiet, certain. She had a presence, like the mountain itself knew better than to shift beneath her. The mission was called Operation Widow 27. At least that was the name on paper. In reality, it was a death sentence disguised as strategy. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that place. But when the transport was delayed and my mother refused to leave me behind, she locked me in that bunker, sealed me in with food, water, and a radio. "In case," she'd said. "There's no preparing a child to watch death through a scope." I watched her unit breach the compound. I watched the muzzle flashes, the arcs of light slicing through dusk. I watched the radios fall silent one by one. They'd been betrayed, not by the enemy, but by the command that sent them in. And I saw her last stand. She didn't falter. She didn't flee. She stood, rifle steady, barking orders even as the walls around her turned to flame. Then she disappeared from the periscope's lens, swallowed by smoke. I didn't move for hours. I didn't call. I just watched. When they came for me, strangers in night vision gear, cold hands hauling me up, their faces hidden, they didn't speak her name. They didn't tell me what happened. They just carried me out. The mission file was sealed, redacted beyond comprehension. The world forgot Major Abigail Carter. The military washed its hands in official silence. But I didn't forget. Years passed and I trained the only way I knew. In private, in isolation. Every rifle I touched, every bolt I learned to smooth, every scope I calibrated. It was all chasing the shadow of her precision. I studied terrain, memorized wind patterns, learned to calculate a shot without paper, just breath and instinct. I wasn't trying to become her. I was trying to speak the language she died speaking. At Fort Bragg, Davis's disdain didn't shrink. It fed on the stillness, on my refusal to explain myself. He paced behind the soldiers, eyes flicking from my bag to my stance, to the absence of a rifle in my hands. "What are you here for, Carter?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You think standing still makes you brave? This is a rifle range, not a cemetery." I didn't answer. He stepped closer, the sun shadowing his face. "You think you can just walk in with a name and claim space? This isn't a memorial." At that, a few soldiers chuckled low in their throats, a rustle of smirks. I caught their words: ghost chaser, armchair patriot. They weren't wrong. I was chasing a ghost. But I was the only one who knew how to find it. I didn't move. I didn't need to. But someone else did. Sergeant Linda Brooks stood off to the side, her posture different from the others. She was older, gray at the edges, eyes sharp like she'd seen enough of war to know better than to laugh at it. She watched me, not with disdain, with calculation. I saw her eyes track mine, following where I watched the distant flags flutter, how I watched the dust rise, how my shoulders shifted with the subtle pulse of the air. She knew wind reading when she saw it. You couldn't fake that. Brooks stepped closer, under her breath but audible. "You know windage." Still I said nothing, but I felt the faintest corner of my mouth turn. She was right. "What's your background?" she asked quietly. "You don't read terrain like that without training." Before I could answer, Davis snapped, "Brooks, back to your post." Brooks lingered a half-second, then obeyed, but not before her eyes fell to the side pocket of my bag. She saw it, the insignia, gray on gray, nearly invisible, a ghost silhouette stitched into the canvas. Her face shifted, not recognition, not fully, but the glimmer of something half remembered. A briefing, a restricted file, an emblem flashed across a projector once, then never again. I'd sewn it myself. A child's tribute grown into a woman's mark. She stepped back, her gaze sharper now, posture straighter. She wasn't watching a civilian anymore. She was watching something she didn't understand yet. I stood still, waiting, reading the wind again, the terrain, the distance. I knew what they saw. A woman without a rifle, without rank, without place. But I wasn't here for them. I was here for her. For the woman who stood her ground when even her country wouldn't. And I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Davis had enough. He strode forward, boots eating the distance between us, the sharp smack of his heels a punctuation of control. The soldiers fell into a hush, all eyes on him, some expectant, others uneasy. Brooks watched too, her gaze darting between us like she knew something was coming, but not what. I didn't flinch when Davis stopped in front of me. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low but coated in disdain. "You've made your statement, Carter. This is my range. Either pick up a rifle or leave." I stared past him, toward the 1,000-yard plate shimmering faintly at the edge of visibility. "I'll leave when I'm done," he scoffed, turning to the others. "Done with what? A speech? A performance?" I reached into the side pocket of my bag and pulled out my ID. Not military issue, but heavier than any badge they carried. The laminated surface caught the sun, the seal deep and dark against its background. I held it up, not with pride, just necessity. Evelyn Carter, civilian consultant, clearance Echo Black. He squinted, then took the card, turning it in his hand. His face shifted, a tight twitch of his jaw. "Echo Black," he repeated. "Why the hell would a civilian rate that?" Brooks stepped closer now, careful, her voice more formal. "Echo Black isn't issued for curiosity, sir." Davis's eyes cut to her, then back to the card. "Consultant in what?" "Historical reconnaissance," I answered. "Mission analysis. Anomalies." "Anomalies." I pointed to the insignia stitched on my bag, the ghost nearly washed into the fabric. "Widow 27. Brooks froze. Even the wind seemed to still around us like it was listening too. A murmur ran through the soldiers, low and uncertain. The name wasn't folklore. It was a file whispered about in dark corners, an operation scrubbed so clean it was like it never existed. But everyone who spent enough time in black briefings heard the number. 27. Widow 27. Brooks' voice was smaller now. "What's your connection?" I looked her in the eye. "Major Abigail Carter." She was my mother. Brooks inhaled sharply, her shoulders stiffening like a string pulled taut. The soldiers whispered among themselves now, the phones that had once captured my humiliation now forgotten. Abigail Carter was the commanding officer on Widow 27, Brooks said, almost to herself. She was the mission, I said. And I was there. Davis's brow nodded, confusion mixing with his stubborn skepticism. You were a kid. What are you trying to prove standing here? I stared at him even in cold. That she existed. That she's not just a ghost in a redacted file. I'm the last line of her story. Brooks swallowed, her eyes never leaving my face. She died in the mission. I shook my head. She was killed in the mission. There was a difference, and Brooks understood it even if she didn't say it aloud. Davis looked between us, his irritation wearing thinner. This is a rifle range, Carter. Not a tribunal. I stepped toward the bench, laying my ID down gently. Then let me shoot. He hesitated. Not because he was convinced, but because something in the air had shifted too far to dismiss. This isn't a demonstration, he muttered. It never was. Brooks stepped forward then, her stance subtle but certain. Sir, let her. Davis turned to her, incredulous. You backing her play now, Brooks? I'm saying, she answered carefully, that we may be watching history unfold. Not bravado. Something in her voice carried weight. The soldiers behind them stayed quiet now, no longer curious, cautious. Davis relented with a sharp sigh, motioning toward the far end. You want to prove something, Carter? 1,000-yard shot. Plates waiting. I nodded once. I know. I unslung my bag, unwrapped my rifle from the cloth. A patchwork of components, each part selected, modified, some scarred from years of use. It wasn't standard issue. It was mine. The assembly was muscle memory. Stock barrel, bolt, scope. No hesitation. No misalignment. Brooks watched my hands, noting how they never wavered. She glanced again at the ghost insignia on my bag. The shadow stitched deep into the canvas, and deeper still into me. I loaded a single round. One shot. The wind was playful at 1,000 yards. Fickle. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing with it, letting the terrain speak. Every flag down the line told me a story in their flutters, in their pauses. When I opened my eyes, the world was narrower. Scope to target. Breath to trigger. My mother's voice surfaced, not in memory but in presence. Breath slow, mind still. Don't pull the trigger, let it go. I squeezed steady. The crack of the shot shattered the air. Half a breath later, the steel plate at 1,000 yards rang clean and true. Silence followed. A stillness not of disbelief but of acknowledgement. I sat back, laid the rifle down, and began dismantling it again. Part by part, each piece returned to stillness. I stood when it was done, my voice soft but firm. If the day comes and they ask who taught you to shoot, I said, not looking at anyone, tell them it was a ghost. Then louder, to the air, to the horizon. I told them, Mom. I told them it was a ghost. Brooks approached, her eyes wet but unashamed. She stopped a few feet away. You should stay, she said. Not as a sniper. As an instructor. I looked at her. Teach them to come back human. The soldiers didn't laugh now. They didn't sneer. They watched me differently, not like a stranger, but a question they didn't yet know how to answer. And that was enough. I waited, ready if she asked again. The soldiers cleared the line slowly. They didn't know how to leave, not properly. Not when the rules of posture and pride had just shifted. They returned to their rifles, but there was less swagger, less noise. A necessary quiet had settled. Brooks lingered nearby, hands at her hips, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but steady. I gathered my bag, packed the rifle pieces as if each one carried breath and memory. When I straightened, Brooks hadn't moved. You weren't bluffing, she said, voice low. No. Widow 27 was always a ghost story, she muttered. You're telling me it was real. And that you watched it? I didn't watch, I said quietly. I survived it. She nodded faintly, chewing on that word, survived. Major Abigail Carter. Brooks said the name like she was testing it aloud, as if hearing it could make it solid. They erased her. They tried. She glanced toward the horizon, where the steel plate still swayed gently from my shot. Why now? She asked. Why come here after all this time? I thought about it, the question I'd been asked before, but never here, never where it mattered. Because they think a dead story stays dead, I answered. Because the last thing my mother told me, before she sealed me in that bunker, was don't let them forget me. Brooke stared at me for a long time. Then just loud enough to cross the space between us. They won't forget now. We stood in the wind for a moment longer before she finally turned, her boots kicking up dust that settled slow and lazy between us. The range commander, Davis, stood off to the side, still watching, still tight with frustration that had nowhere to land. His authority had held, technically, but something bigger than rank had passed through, and he couldn't unsee it. He walked past me, stopping short of eye contact. "You're not cleared to train here," he muttered. "I'm not here to train." He glanced sideways, a muscle tight in his jaw. "Then why stay?" "To remind them," I said, "that there are stories buried deeper than doctrine." He didn't respond. He just kept walking, his shadow long behind him. I found myself returning to the range each day that week. I didn't ask permission. I didn't need to. I didn't shoot again. Not right away. Instead, I watched. I watched the young soldiers calibrate their sights, adjust for wind, read distance with calculators they didn't fully trust. I watched their breathing, shallow, rushed, disconnected from the pulse of the shot. Brooks noticed. She started keeping a post closer to where I stood, saying nothing, just being there. A silent truce. On the fourth morning, she approached as I watched a private struggle with the 600-yard mark. His shots landed inches wide each time, frustration building like a storm behind his eyes. "You're not correcting him," Brooks said to me. "He's not asking." She chuckled under her breath. "You're your mother's daughter." I read a redacted file once. Said she taught her team restraint before precision. Called it earning the rifle. She did. Brooks folded her arms. "We teach aim. We don't teach patience." "Then you're building weapons, not soldiers." That landed. She looked at me sideways, the edge of a grin not quite reaching her mouth. "Stay," she said again. "Teach them how to come home." I didn't answer. But I didn't say no. That evening, I found myself near the memorial wall, the one they kept hidden behind admin offices, away from ceremonies and photo ops. The names there were old, the brass dulled, the stone cracked in places. But hers was there. Major Abigail Carter. Widow 27. I traced her name with my fingers, the chill of the stone settling into my skin. She wasn't just a name. She was the unfinished sentence of every mission that went wrong and stayed buried. The wind carried the sound of evening drills from afar, the distant crack of rifles, the bark of orders. I closed my eyes. For a moment I was back in the bunker, the periscope pressed to my face, the hiss of sand against the walls, her voice in my ear. "Don't let them forget me." I opened my eyes. "I won't." I stood until the stars came out, the air cooler, the wind quieter. Then I walked back to the barracks they let me use, plain, cold but familiar. In the morning I would return to the range. Not to shoot, to watch. And to wait until they asked me to teach them what she gave me, not how to pull a trigger but how to understand what pulling it costs. I didn't volunteer. They asked. It began with Private Ellison, the same kid I watched struggle with the 600-yard mark. He glanced over at me between reloads, sweat pooling at his neck, his frustration laid bare in his hands, stiff and clumsy around the bolt. "What am I missing?" he muttered, not even looking my way when he asked. I stepped closer, slow, deliberate. I watched his eyes twitch with reluctance. Asking for help from a civilian wasn't prideful, but failure was worse. "You're breathing wrong," I told him. "You breathe like the rifle's an accident." He stared at me, confused. I knelt beside him, pointing toward the terrain. The wind wasn't heavy that morning, but it carried in short bursts. Unpredictable if you didn't know how to count the stillness between. "Watch the flags," I said. "Not just the one in front of you, all of them. Read their rhythm. Then breathe with them." Ellison's breathing was sharp, uneven. I guided his shoulders gently, nudging him to exhale slowly, to let his chest fall with the quiet. "Shoot when you're part of it," I whispered. "Not before." He fired again. The round struck inches closer, not perfect but no longer guessing. Brooks watched from a few paces back, saying nothing, her arms crossed but her posture soft. Others noticed. By the end of the day, 2 more soldiers approached quietly, questions in their eyes, pride muted by curiosity. I taught them the way she taught me, no grand instruction, no speeches, just presence, breathing, stillness. By the week's end, a pattern had formed. They waited for me after morning drills, rifles in hand, faces unguarded. They stopped calling me a tourist. They called me Carter, and that was enough. Brooks found me by the wall one evening, the sun bleeding out of the sky in red sheets. "You're building something here," she said. I traced my mother's name on the stone, the letters faint in the dying light. "Not building," I replied. "Restoring." She nodded, thoughtful. "Davis is still pissed, but he's not stopping it." "He can't." She chuckled low. "Because if he did, they'd follow you off his range." I looked at her, her face half-shadowed. She wasn't mocking me. She was warning me kindly. "You're not going to last long without formal clearance to teach," she added. "I don't need their forms." "No," she admitted, "but you'll need allies." She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I'll help you. I'll vouch." I stared at her, waiting for the catch. She read my silence. "I knew men and women who served under your mother," Brooks said. "They didn't talk about Widow 27, but they remembered her. I won't let her stay buried." I believed her. By the second week, I carried no rifle. I didn't need to. They watched me read the sky, the flags, the terrain. They learned without being told that the shot was the last part of the process, not the first. We gathered after drills. I stood with them at the benches, showing them how to let the rifle become an extension of their body, not by strength but surrender. "Your trigger finger is the end of a question," I said. "Make sure you understand it before you answer." Some didn't get it. Others did. That was enough. Brooks stood near, correcting stances, guiding where I could not. We were an odd pair, the civilian ghost and the career sergeant, but it worked. One afternoon, Davis approached. He stood off to the side, watching me instruct Ellison on reading mirage lines downrange. "You don't have rank," he muttered. I didn't turn. "I have history. You're making this personal." It was always personal. He left without another word, but he didn't stop me. Not after Brooks started showing up beside me with notepads, formalizing what I taught into something the chain of command could tolerate. In quiet hours, I returned to the memorial. I never went with anyone. That space was still just mine and hers. The stone remained cold, even in sunlight. "I'm still here, Mom," I whispered once. "They're listening." I wanted to believe she heard me. I thought about the bunker, the way her voice had sounded through the static. She was never desperate, just firm, clear, as if she knew her story would never survive without me. Some nights I dreamed of the periscope, of the lens fogging as I watched her disappear into the smoke. I woke up angry, not because she died but because they forgot. But here I was making sure they wouldn't forget. And in that, maybe I wasn't chasing a ghost anymore. Maybe I was becoming one, the kind that teaches, not haunts. By the third week, I didn't have to speak first anymore. They gathered in the mornings without being called. They cleaned their rifles before asking for guidance. They scanned the flags without prompt, counting wind shifts under their breath like prayers. I watched them from the edge of the line and I saw the change. Their shoulders weren't rigid. They weren't aiming to hit. They were waiting to understand. Brooks had formalized the sessions now. She wrote it up as supplemental instruction, a term polite enough for the chain of command to ignore rather than endorse. She stood by my side when I spoke, correcting forms, reinforcing my words with the weight of her rank. The first live field exercise came sooner than expected. A scenario designed to simulate long-range interdiction, a test not just of aim but of judgment. Brooks gave me space to watch. She didn't interfere. She wanted me to see what the soldiers had become. They moved in pairs, spotting and shooting, but before each trigger pull, I saw hesitation, not uncertainty but calculation. Breath measured. Wind accounted for. Time respected. Private Ellison, once the frustrated shot, waited an extra beat, scanning not just the target, but the field around it, the mirage lines that told him where heat distorted sight. His shot cracked clean and I heard his breath catch just before it hit home. It wasn't perfect, but it was considered. Afterward, Brooks approached me where I stood beyond the range's edge. You see it, she said. I nodded. They're not just hitting targets. They're thinking. She smiled faintly. You did that. I shook my head. She did. Brooks didn't argue. She just stood with me watching the sunset dye the sky in rust and gold. Later that week, a message came down from the top. Davis delivered it in person. His face pinched but his voice resigned. They want you to stay, he muttered. Officially. I stared at him, waiting for the condition. You'll consult, he said, eyes flicking to Brooks. Instruction. Discipline. But unofficial. No rank. No uniform. Good, I said. He blinked. Why? Because I'm not theirs. He didn't understand. He didn't need to. Brooks did. She stood behind him, arms folded, a smirk tugging at her mouth. They're scared of ghosts, she said quietly. I smiled, but only for a moment. At night, I visited the memorial wall alone. The stone was familiar now, the chill less biting. I'd cleaned the grime from her name myself. Abigail Carter. Widow 27. No flowers. No medals. Just touch. My fingers pressed to the brass letters, my breath warm against the stone. They're learning, Mom, I whispered. They're asking the right questions. I thought about the bunker again, the static, the periscope, the smoke that swallowed her. In my mind, I still saw her standing. She wasn't fallen. She wasn't gone. She was there waiting. Maybe that's all a ghost is. A story waiting to be finished. I stood back from the wall and traced the other names too. Names without voices, without graves their families could find. I carried them too. Not by choice. By blood. Brooks asked me one morning, "What would your mother think if she saw you here?" I didn't answer right away. Then, she'd tell me to teach them everything, so they never have to be buried in a file no one reads. Brooks nodded. And if they don't listen? They will. She raised an eyebrow. You sure? I looked at the soldiers practicing at the 1,000-yard line. Their forms tighter, their patience clearer. No wasted shots. They're listening already. We stood together, the civilian and the sergeant, watching history rewrite itself one breath, one trigger, one ghost at a time. The wind was low the night I returned to the wall. The sky hung heavy with stars, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel earned. I stood alone, the stone cool under my hand, her name smooth beneath my fingertips. Major Abigail Carter. Widow 27. I'd traced it enough times to know every groove, every imperfection in the engraving. It wasn't just her name. It was proof. I didn't speak right away. I let the stillness do what it was meant to. Remind me that silence wasn't emptiness. It was memory. They know now, Mom, I whispered. They see you. They see all of them. I thought about the soldiers on the line, their breathing steadier, their shots fewer but sharper. I thought about Brooks standing beside me, steady as a stone, carrying the past without pretending it was light. I thought about the ghost I'd become, not a shadow but a reminder. I'm not just remembering you, I said softly. I'm becoming you. As the wind moved, I stood straighter, the night settling like a blanket over the range, the barracks, the fields where men trained and forgot, and sometimes remembered. I was done chasing ghosts. Now I was one, and I was still standing.